CBS Radio presents Is Cuba Going Red? CBS News correspondent Stuart Novins has just returned from Cuba, where he spent 2 months in an exhaustive study of the revolutionary government as it has emerged under Fidel Castro. He traveled throughout the island talking to hundreds of people of all backgrounds and examined a mass of documentary evidence. For an examination of the question, Is Cuba Going Red? Here now is Mr. Novins.
Good evening. The inescapable fact is brutally simple. The island of Cuba, 90 miles off our shores, site of the American naval base that guards our southern defenses, anchor for our defense of the Panama Canal, and key to the political future of Latin America, this Cuban island is today a totalitarian dictatorship and is rapidly becoming a communist beachhead in the Caribbean. Despite the protestations of democracy by Fidel Castro, despite the promise of the rebellion that ousted the corrupt police state of Batista, Cuba is today a one-man government held together by promises and fear, and control of the island's economic, political, and social institutions is rapidly being taken over from that one man, Fidel Castro, whether he knows it or not, by what is emerging in the opinion of Western diplomatic sources as the best organized communist apparatus in the Caribbean. It is no longer possible for Cubans to express publicly any opposition to the government without incurring swift and arbitrary reprisals. Any criticism of the Fidel Castro government is now denounced as counter-revolutionary, and government practice makes counter-revolution punishable by property confiscation, imprisonment, and/or death. Nowhere has the term counter-revolution been legally defined. That is why this report will be told in my voice rather than the voices of Cubans themselves. Cuba's rebellion, which ended with the flight of Batista on January 1st, created a perfect laboratory and target for communist penetration. Here's how it works. In the classic strategy of communist infiltration, there are two main tactics: to impoverish and make impotent the rich and middle class, and deliberately to create mass unemployment, hunger, and discontent among the poor. In the ensuing chaos, the communist hardcore, already infiltrated into key control points of the government and the economy, can then take over. What are the checkpoints to watch for in a totalitarian state? You look at the general economy for its effect on the lives of the people, and particularly of the middle class. You look for the development of political opposition parties and the government's attitude toward them. A vital key is the press and news media. No totalitarian government can operate without total reliance on its army, so you look for the political complexions of the army's leaders, for signs of purges within army ranks, for political indoctrination of troops. You examine the country's court and judicial system. You check the labor unions. Are they free? The final and basic test, of course, of any government is, can the people change their government or its policies by peaceful ballot? Now let's apply those checkpoints to what is happening in Cuba today. The top man, the Secretary General of the Cuban Confederation of Labor, is David Salvador. As head of the CTC, the only and all-inclusive Central Labor Organization, Salvador is one of the most powerful men in Cuba today. He was appointed to his post by Fidel Castro. 2 weeks ago, we interviewed the 38-year-old Salvador in Havana. We asked him, do you control the electric and power industry? His answer, yes, all of it. Do you control the communications industry? Yes, all of it. Transportation, trucks, railroads, merchant marine? Yes, all of it. Printers, pressmen, newspaper workers? Yes, all of it. He said he controlled all of the sugar industry, tobacco, all of the aviation industry, food marketers. In short, if David Salvador pushes the button, all of Cuban economic activity stops. This is true. It is also true that Salvador admitted that he was a communist when he was younger, that as recently as 1954, he ran for office in Cuba on the Communist Party ticket. He says he is not a communist today. Despite that denial, information made available to this reporter indicates that during the last 2 years, Salvador was part of the underground communist movement as well as of the rebel movement, that he operated under the code name of Mario, that he maintained contact with the party chiefly through 3 known card-carrying communists, or their couriers: Lázaro Peña, a veteran party labor movement leader; Blas Roca, another communist labor movement activist, both of whom were outside of Cuba; and Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, key strategist and political action expert of the Cuban equivalent of the Politburo, who remained inside Cuba. On March 22nd, Salvador was seated on the platform before the presidential palace in Havana when Jose Figueres, ex-president of Costa Rica, spoke before thousands of workers at a labor rally. Figueres pointed to the dangers of communism in Latin America and urged Cuba to take a pro-Western position in the Cold War. Salvador jumped from his seat, grabbed the microphone from Figueres, and shouted, "We cannot side with the Americans who oppress us." Shortly thereafter, Castro called for Cuban neutrality in the Cold War. Salvador's Confederation of Labor spreads into every aspect of Cuban life. It is one jaw of the vice that grips the whole economy. The other jaw of the vice is the government itself. On March 10th, the government issued a decree that arbitrarily cut all apartment and house rentals 50% on $100 apartments, 40% on apartments up to $200. Traditionally, middle-class savings have gone into apartments like these. But now the apartment house owners, their income cut in half, still face mortgage and loan payments that have not been reduced proportionately. The communist-dominated unions have simultaneously raised the cost of painters, electricians, carpenters, maintenance workers. All new construction in Cuba, for practical purposes, has stopped. 120,000 construction workers have no work to do. With the grinding to a halt of the construction industry, the steel industry, cement production, and subsidiary manufacture has been cut back an estimated 60%. On April 8th, the government issued another decree that says, in effect, all privately owned but vacant land must now be sold to anyone who wants to build on it. And the government fixed the price of $4 a meter, regardless of the original cost to the owner. The practical expropriation implicit in these two decrees alone have not only virtually wiped out savings of the middle-class owners, they have brought more unemployment to the workers. They have created so much uncertainty that banks are refusing to make loans. Cuban investment capital is virtually frozen. As investment shrinks, production drops off, and on almost every industry in Cuba, there has been a simultaneous demand from David Salvador's Confederation of Labor to add more people to the payrolls at higher wages. These demands are enforced by slowdown strikes on the part of the workers and by sabotage. They are supported by the government. When a company has almost exhausted its resources, the government, to keep the payrolls going, arbitrarily takes over its management. This process is known as interventing. More than 475 large businesses have been intervented by the government. More are on the way. No one knows or has said publicly what happens to these companies when all the cash is gone. There is no doubt that Cuba's poor have been exploited in the past. No doubt that genuine reforms are needed. But the unemployment figure of 40% of the workforce that Castro inherited on January 1st has now expanded to almost 50% of jobless or below subsistence level. And it will get bigger in the next 4 months. Sugar grinding ends this month, and that will put about 200,000 more out of jobs. Fidel Castro has ordered a Buy Cuban Products campaign and enforced it with powerful publicity and increased tariffs. The announced purpose? To increase Cuban production and stop the flow of dollars out of the country. But here's what's happening in one sample industry. There are about 400 Cuban and foreign drug companies in the country. The government has indicated imminent tariff increases on imported raw drugs which are packaged in Cuba. Simultaneously, the government has cut imported drug prices 20%, although Cuban drug prices have been frozen for years and packaging costs have jumped 60%. The result? Of the 400 drug companies, only about 40 will survive. More workers face joblessness. The rapid disintegration of Cuba's economy from the most flourishing economy in the Caribbean area fits the classic pattern that makes easy a communist takeover if the other control points check out too. Let's look at those. The bilateral squeeze, government on the one side, communist-led unions on the other, that has clamped down on business, has also clamped down on businesses' advertising budgets. With revenue cut, most news media, newspapers, radio, television, are operating very close to economic failure. The government has just decreed a 30% wage increase for editorial employees. Many papers will have to close down. One Havana television station and a chain of radio stations have already been taken over by the government on political grounds. This network is now called Rebel Radio, and it is run by Violeta Casals, a communist. The newspaper Revolucion is the voice of Castro's 26th of July movement. Its editor is Carlos Franchi, a former staffer of the Communist Party newspaper Hoy. Both papers, Revolucion and Hoy, frequently publish the same stories under the same headlines. They frequently run parallel editorial lines. Hoy increasingly gives credit to the communists for having started the anti-Batista revolution. Fidel Castro, in a series of speeches which reached a high point during the week preceding his friendship visit to the United States, publicly accused the Associated Press, the United Press International, Time magazine, and other U.S. news sources with being paid by what he calls the international oligarchies to print lies about his government. Immediately following the Castro attacks on the American press services, the United Press office in Havana received 3 telephone threats that its headquarters would be bombed. The families of some of the employees have been threatened with harm. The union has moved in with new demands. Castro has made similar attacks on Cuban papers. Within the past 2 months, 3 papers, Avance, Prensa Libre, and Zigzag, which raised tentative questions about government policies, were publicly castigated by Castro, who urged his listeners to boycott them. There has been no marked editorial probing of government policy by those papers since then. A leading anti-communist writes for the newspaper El Mundo, one of the largest. His name is Juan Luis Martin. Martin, who wrote about the increased danger of communist infiltration in Latin America, was secretly arrested by the Castro police and imprisoned without charges in La Cabaña Fortress, the army prison, 5 weeks ago. For 2 days, there was no public knowledge of his arrest. His paper, El Mundo, printed nothing about it. A Times of Havana reporter learned about it. He called El Mundo, who confirmed the arrest, but declined to say why it had remained silent. For more than 2 weeks, Martin was kept incommunicado. Friends of Martin commissioned a man, Dr. Oscar Molina, a lawyer and newspaperman, to act as Martin's counsel. Molina was told that as a lawyer he could not see Martin until 24 hours before his trial, for which no date had been set. He was told that as a newsman, his application for a pass to the prison cells had been denied. When it became apparent that the lid might be blown off the story on the eve of Fidel Castro's trip to the United States, Revolucion, the paper run by Carlos Franchi, printed a story which quoted the La Cabaña Purging Commission. It was the first time this term had been used. The Purging Commission, said Revolucion, had explained Martin's arrest on the grounds that Martin had allegedly been employed as a professor of military history at the Army Staff School under Batista, and that he had been employed as a translator for BRAC, the Bureau for the Repression of Communists. The Purging Commission explanation did not explain that Martin had held the same jobs under the pre-Batista administrations of Carlos Prio and Grau San Martin. It did not explain why the newsman's arrest had been secret, why he had been held incommunicado, why he had been forbidden to see his lawyer, his friends, or his family, or why no official charges had been filed against him. As of April 16th, he was still incommunicado. The newsprint, the paper on which all Cuban newspapers are printed, is imported. The government import license can be canceled or the import quotas cut down. The only exceptions are Hoy, the Communist Party paper, and Revolucion, edited by Carlos Franchi. They use paper made from bagasse, a sugarcane byproduct. To summarize the condition of the press, the papers are financially unstable, morally intimidated, with Hoy, Revolucion, and Fidel Castro beating down opposition or criticism. While there is no official censorship, there is, for practical purposes of opposition, no free press in Cuba today. Radio and television are in much the same position, different stations to differing degrees. The broadcast bellwethers are Rebel Radio, led by communist Violeta Casals, and Union Radio, run by David Salvador. It is not only news and current opinion that is being stifled, history is being rewritten. Fidel Castro has appointed a new committee to do the job. It is called the Commission on Revision of Cuban History Books. It was conceived when Castro, in a public appearance, stated that American participation in the Spanish-American War was for imperialist motives. He said Cuban textbooks should be revised to show this and to correct other misconceptions. The committee is dominated by Elias Entrango, a former member of the Communist Front Congress for Peace, and a close associate of Juan Marinello, leader of the Cuban Communist Party. Emilio Roig Leuschenring of the Commission is a strongly anti-American historian of the city of Havana, a government post. Western authoritative sources list him as probably a communist, certainly a fellow traveler. Let's look at the Army. Raul Castro, brother of Fidel, named by Fidel as his successor as head of the revolutionary movement, denies that he is a communist. The record shows that in 1953, Raul went to Vienna for a Communist Front Congress and then disappeared in Bucharest behind the Iron Curtain for several weeks. On March 30th this year, he addressed a workers' meeting in Cuba, defending David Salvador's anti-American outburst against Jose Figueres and supporting neutrality for Cuba in the Cold War. Members of the 26 July movement told this reporter that in 1957, Raul Castro threatened to kill his brother Fidel over disagreements with rebel activity. Raul Castro controls all the armed forces and the police. His wife, Vilma Espin, has communist associations. Her sister is at least a pro-communist. Raul Castro has appointed a communist, Lieutenant Gonzales Montichi, as commander of the Central Cuban Army Arsenal at San Ambrosio. Montichi's brother Enrique, also a communist, is active in the Confederation of Labor and particularly in unions that deal with television stations. The Army commander in Santiago is Comandante Manuel Pinheiro. The Army commander in Las Villas is Demetrio Monsegni. Informed and completely reliable sources classify them as communists or communist supporters. The Army commander of La Cabaña Fortress, the military and political prison where many of the more than 500 executions have taken place, is Ernesto Che Guevara, a professional revolutionary from Argentina who actively supported Jacobo Arbenz, the communist leader in Guatemala. A month ago, Guevara's second-in-command, Comandante Benjamin Camino, an open anti-communist, was arrested. The casual explanation, conspiracy, no specifications given. He has not been heard from publicly since. The man who was defense attorney in the Sosa Blanco Sports Palace trial, Captain Aristides da Costa, was also defense attorney for the Cuban Air Force pilots who were found innocent of war crimes by a military court and then personally ordered to be retried and found guilty by Fidel Castro. As an Army captain, he was ordered back from the Santiago trial to Havana. He was met at the airport by a group of armed guards. He said to reporters present, "I do not think I am under arrest." But he has since resigned from the Army and has not been seen publicly since. The man who was presiding judge at the first trial of the pilots, the trial at which they had been acquitted, was Major Felix Peña. On April 14th, his body was found in his car. A pistol bullet had been fired into his chest. The Army press chief, Captain Manolo Iglesias, called it suicide, said a note had been found near Peña which read, "This is motivated by personal reasons and thus must not be mixed with politics in any way." The Army holds indoctrination courses. The man in charge of the Army information program, including political education, is Lieutenant Alfredo Guevara, a communist. In many Army posts, the only or most widely circulated newspaper is the Communist Party paper, Hoy. In local police stations, they too are under Raul Castro's control. Classes in arithmetic, reading, and so forth are given to the police. This reporter has seen police orders which direct that promising policemen be selected by the teachers for political indoctrination at the Army's Camp Columbia, now called Libertad. This reporter has also seen orders directing that no member of the police force shall make any public statement about political indoctrination. What happens to people who are arrested? There is no habeas corpus in Cuba. That fundamental right in any free society was suspended at Fidel Castro's direction on February 2nd. Arrests can be secret and frequently are. It is impossible to get from any government source even the number of people who are now under arrest in the country. Prisoners are not charged with specific accusations until about 24 hours before their trials, often weeks or months after their arrest. Prisoners can be and often are held incommunicado. People have been imprisoned for alleged crimes that do not appear in any written laws or are punished by sentences that are not provided for by law. There is no Bill of Rights. In Havana, the government has opened a denunciation center. Here, individuals may come and denounce to police anyone whom they wish to charge with counter-revolution. The accused is arrested. He is investigated, sometimes for long periods of time. If he is found guilty of this legally undefined crime, he is sentenced. If he is found innocent, he is allowed to leave. But his business colleagues, his friends, are reluctant to associate with him because his case can be reopened at any time. Let's look at the schools. At a speech in March before 386 teachers at the Ministry of Education, the Undersecretary of Education, Luis Labredo, said, "The government has plans to eliminate in all schools, public or private, the teaching of English." When asked by a teacher what benefit this would bring to Cuba, he answered, "We are not here to make Cuba an American colony." In the public school system, at least 3,300 employees, including 500 teachers and 27 professors, were fired in February and March. Many of them had taught for more than 20 years. 2,500 were fired in one single day, March 31st. Now the law says that none of the remaining teachers or any that may be hired from now on may be fired for any reason. The way is clear for the hiring of communists or sympathizers. The Minister of Education is 27-year-old Armando Hart, described by those close to him as at least a left-wing radical. His wife, Aide Santa Maria, a close advisor and aide to Fidel Castro in the mountains, is evaluated as a fellow traveler and longtime associate of known communists. Let's look at the Cuban ballot, the chance for free elections. In early January, Fidel Castro said, "We will hold elections in 18 months or 2 years." We asked him then why he didn't do it at once, and his reply was that there was no political opposition. He said he wanted time for political opposition parties to develop. Has political opposition been given a chance to develop? The answer is unequivocally no. The fact is that political opposition is now legalistically synonymous with counter-revolution, punishable by property confiscation, imprisonment, death. On April 9th in Havana and April 12th in Camagüey, Fidel Castro said that Cuba will hold elections only when everyone has a job, when every farmer owns his own land, when illiteracy is wiped out, when, he said, Cuba has regained its sovereignty. And he added, only the reactionaries want us to hold elections now. The most conservative estimate possible is that under ideal conditions, this represents at least a 20-year program. But here in the United States, where elections are thought to be important, Fidel Castro said last week that he thought Cuba would have elections in 4 years. The flexibility of Castro's predictions enforces those who believe that Fidel Castro, hungry for approval and adulation, will persuasively tell any given audience what he thinks it wants to hear. What about Castro himself? What is his part in the communist plan for infiltration? There is no evidence to support the charge that Fidel Castro is a member of the Communist Party. It is most probable that he is not. He has been a revolutionary throughout most of his relatively mature years. He has cleaned graft out of the government. His economic, social, and political program is generally believed to be sincerely motivated but completely whimsical and unplanned. He has an uncanny and great talent for persuasive language, but the record shows that his speeches are frequently self-contradictory. He has kindled hopes for Cuba's poor that can never be extinguished and probably never realized, but they are the golden promises that can be held out by the communists if it becomes obvious that Castro cannot deliver. He can take no criticism and little advice. He is naive economically, inexperienced administratively, stubborn as well as naive politically. He has provided and supported a climate for communist expansion. He has provided and supported an open expression of anti-Americanism that is spreading fast. Most knowledgeable Cubans will agree that if the Confederation of Labor called a general strike tomorrow and Fidel Castro came out against it on anti-communist grounds, he still has enough support to kill the strike. But these same men will tell you that 8 months from now, in the same dilemma, Castro might not have the power to kill it. Many Cubans believe that Castro may already be too deeply enmeshed in communist support to pull out. All are agreed that if anything happens to Castro physically, Cuba would be plunged into the worst bloodbath of its history. Some, the newly organizing underground, say violence is now the only way left to throw the communists out, and that means a bloodbath. And meanwhile, by using the economic situation as an excuse, Fidel Castro consistently dodges the one solution, free elections. If he were to make possible now truly free elections guaranteed by constitutional safeguards, the ballot would replace his communist-exploited personal dictatorship with a constitutional democracy. It would force the communists into an open count instead of a conspiracy. It would strengthen the anti-communists who feel they have now no course to take but violence. And Fidel Castro himself would emerge as a greater Cuban hero than ever. But without free constitutional elections, so far as the United States is concerned, it really doesn't matter whether Castro is a communist or a willing dupe of communists. The result in Cuba is the same. As one Western observer put it, if it looks like a tiger and growls like a tiger and has claws and teeth and muscles like a tiger's, if it produces cubs that act like tiger cubs, it would be the prudent decision of a reasonable man not to open its cage and invite it home to lunch. This is Stuart Novins. Good night.
You've been listening to Is Cuba Going Red? A special CBS News report by CBS News correspondent Stuart Novins, who has just returned after an exhaustive fact-finding tour of Cuba. His report was based on lengthy interviews with hundreds of people and a study of a mass of documentary evidence. This special report on the question, Is Cuba Going Red?, came to you from CBS News on the CBS Radio Network.
Is Cuba Going Red? Part 2. 2 weeks ago, CBS Radio presented a special report by CBS News correspondent Stuart Novins on Is Cuba Going Red? Today, CBS presents a special discussion on this vital issue. First, here is CBS News correspondent Dallas Townsend.
2 weeks ago today, CBS News presented a special report entitled, Is Cuba Going Red? Correspondent Stuart Novins reported that Cuba today is becoming a totalitarian dictatorship and is rapidly becoming a communist beachhead in the Caribbean. The program attracted wide attention and much favorable comment. It also drew criticism from representatives of the Cuban government who asked to be heard on the subject. CBS News stands behind its initial report. The material was carefully researched, reported, and checked. CBS News also points out that beginning in the spring of 1957, when its men visited Fidel Castro in the Sierra Maestro, it has reported what he and other representatives of the 26th of July movement have had to say. Dr. Castro has appeared on Face the Nation. President Urrutia has appeared in an interview and has been quoted frequently. Several representatives of the current Cuban administration appeared in Castro's Cuba, a new special aired on January 28th of this year. Since the first of this year, the Cuban government's viewpoint has been quoted and reported on numerous occasions and on various news shows. Nevertheless, because of the lively reaction to the program of 2 weeks ago, and because of the vital importance of this subject to all Americans, CBS News has decided to provide an opportunity for continued discussion of the issues raised in Is Cuba Going Red? CBS News points out that it's interested only in reporting the facts, that it's not a partisan on the subject of Cuba or on any other subject. It is objectively reporting the situation in Cuba today as it did during previous Cuban administrations. Now, today's panel, here is our moderator, Howard K. Smith.
How do you do? The topic is Cuba Going Red, and the participants, Dr. Ernesto de Higo, Cuban ambassador to the United States, Mr. Carlos Lechuga, Cuban delegate to the UN, Dr. Manuel Bisbey, Cuban ambassador to the UN, CBS News correspondent Stuart Novins, Congressman Charles Porter of Oregon, who has taken a special interest in Latin American affairs, Mr. Leo Chern, the executive director of the Research Institute of America. May we begin with correspondent Stuart Novins?
Yes, Howard. It is the policy of CBS News that its reporters are reporters and not debaters. I want to make it clear that I am a reporter and not a debater. I am here because personal attacks have been made against me after the report that was made 2 weeks ago. I would wish to state very clearly that the report that we made 2 weeks ago was not motivated in any way by any kind of malice. It was a friendly warning which was held up both to the Cuban people, the Cuban government, and the American people. If there are any errors in the report, they are variances of detail if they exist and do not alter the findings of the program. I stand by those, as does CBS News. I think there's one thing more, if I may. The charges have been made in the Cuban press since our report that, in effect, I am in the pay of Mr. Batista. There was another charge that Mr. Batista owned either part of or all of the Columbia Broadcasting System. I don't need to comment on the second report. But on the charge that I am in the pay of Batista, I would point out that I was among the first to report the Batista administration as the kind of reprehensible dictatorship which it was. And I think I will stand on that record. Gentlemen, to you who represent Cuba, I can understand why you would disagree publicly with what I had to say 2 weeks ago. I ask only that you accept that what I said or may say in this coming half hour is motivated by a friendship out of Cuba, for Cuba and for Cuba's people. And Congressman Porter, I think we should say for the record that you, although you are a congressman, you are here, I believe, it's my understanding, as a private individual.
Well, can we hear now from Mr. Carlos Lechuga, Cuba's delegate to the United Nations?
Well, we'll read a brief statement answering in a general way what Mr. Novin said 2 weeks ago. I want to say to the American public that only 90 miles away from the Florida coast, the island Republic of Cuba is rapidly becoming one of the most solid democracies of the hemisphere. Its people have at last regained the joy of living. They have placed their faith and their trust in the conviction that Cuba's present government will give the nation a permanent system of social justice and respect for human rights. The struggle of the Cuban rebels has been rewarded by the immense popular backing of the present government. It is not true what Mr. Stuart Novin said in his program, that the Cubans cannot express in public any opposition. The proofs are on the contrary. It is not true that 475 large businesses have been intervened by the government on economic or political grounds. All of these enterprises were affected by a decree of the Ministry of the Recovery of Stolen Government Property which was one of the measures most hoped for by the Cuban people, since it enables the Republic to recover part of the millions of dollars stolen by Batista and his partners. It is not true that the government has just decreed a 30% wage increase for editorial employees, and because that many papers will have to close down. In order to ensure the existence of a free press, the new Cuban government has stopped subsidizing newspapers and are studying how to solve the economic situation of some of the publications, but no decisions have taken yet. The Cuban press now enjoys absolute editorial freedom. The fact that any figure of the government responds to some criticisms does not mean that free press is being curtailed. On the contrary, it is another instance of the free play of opinions, just as it exists in the United States. When President Roosevelt or President Truman, for example, referred to a certain American columnist in rather harsh terms, no one here thought of this as censorship. There has been talk about the attack against some American news agencies and publications. Obviously, Cubans cannot remain silent in the face of unfair criticisms or when these agencies and publications distort the facts for the sake of sensationalism and try to undermine the prestige of the government. It is ridiculous, as Mr. Novins did, to quote a three-line item from the Soviet newspaper Izvestia, which mentioned the campaign that certain segments of the American press had launched against Cuba and used it as a proof of Soviet support. What has Cuba to do with it all? Izvestia has sometimes published statements made by President Eisenhower, and no one has ever drawn the conclusion that he is a communist, neither Mr. Novins. In the CBS program 2 weeks ago, it was said that the Havana United Press office had received several telephone calls threatening to bomb their local office. We do not know how many calls were made, or if in fact the rumor quoted by Mr. Novins is true. However, both Mr. Novins and we are sure that no bomb was ever placed at the UP office. Another point raised by Mr. Novins came as a surprise to us. He said that the Cuban government had the right to cancel paper import license. The truth is that the regulation operating in Cuba, more or less, is the same one existing in the United States as regards Canadian paper. And we could say of the U.S. government what Mr. Novins says ours. Western diplomatic sources, to use the same pattern of Mr. Novins, told us that when he, in May 3rd, asserted that the newspaperman Juan Luis Martin was under arrest on April 16th, he was released 10 days before Mr. Novin's program and is free in his home in Havana. He was imprisoned not because he is an anti-communist, but for different reasons. Not one of the anti-communist Cuban newspapermen are in jail and never were. All of them, including me, are writing daily, attacking them as always. The new Cuba is a working democracy, and that indeed is the only truth.
That was an opening statement of the Cuban point of view. Gentlemen, may I ask you in your further opening statements to try to keep them quiet, keep them short, because a half hour is a very short time. Dr. Bisbee.
I cannot justify the report made by Mr. Stuart Novins, Is Cuba Going Red, after Dr. Castro's trip to the United States. In fact, our Prime Minister explained very clearly the democratic position of our government and dispelled several false statements and rumors about the influence of communism in the present Cuban moment. Of course, there are communists in Cuba, but there are also communists in this country. Nevertheless, because of this, Mr. Novins will not call red the government of the United States. Mr. Novins cannot prove what he says. For instance, he interviewed Mr. David Salvador, chief of the Cuban labor movement, and asked him if he was not a communist, since nobody has denied that he was a communist when he was young. And Mr. Salvador answered, I am not a communist now. This would suffice for anybody, but not for Mr. Novins. In spite of this, Mr. Novins affirms without any proof that Mr. Salvador is a communist. That is false, absolutely false. I can assure and prove that when the April 1958 strike was being organized, Mr. Salvador, who for some years had been a member of the 26th of July movement, rejected the participation of the communist leader in this strike. And I can add that at present, Mr. Salvador is successfully struggling against the communists in the reorganization of the CTC, Cuban Confederation of Labor. This is the truth, and the whole truth about Mr. Salvador. Why does Mr. Novins make these assertions without proof and tries to mislead American public opinion? Certainly, in Cuba, the revolutionary government does not persecute the communists, but this, we maintain, is the right position, because if they are persecuted, then you make martyrs out of them.
Well, Dr. Bisbee, I want to return to some of those points.
A little time. We think that the best way to fight communists is to solve the economic needs of the people. I conclude. We must reaffirm democracy and build up democracy. My personal opinion is that to be anti-red only is not the best way to guarantee democracy in this crucial moment that we are living.
Thank you. Dr. Diego.
Thank you. I only want to say that I think that Mr. Novin's report was not quite fair on account that some of the facts he said were not presented on their true light. I'm going to refer only to 2 or 3 examples. For example, when he interviews David Salvador, he takes a film and he asks David Salvador if he controls the different unions: telephone, sugar, bankers, laboratories, airlines, radio, television. What does the American public see? Mr. Salvador in the film nodding yes. And what was the truth? Mr. Salvador answers in Spanish, that union is organized. That other union that's organized too. But the impression the American public got was that Mr. Salvador was saying yes, that he, who was presented as a communist few words later, had the control of all the union workers in Cuba. A second case is this. Mr. Novins refers to lawyer Da Costa. Da Costa was the lawyer for the aviators that were tried in Santiago de Cuba. And Mr. Novin says the following: but he has since resigned from the army and has not been seen publicly since. The implication is that lawyer Da Costa has been put under arrest or killed, or he has to go away from Cuba. I know personally Mr. Da Costa. He is the brother-in-law of a very close friend of mine. And I can assure Mr. Novins that it is true that Mr. Da Costa resigned from the army, but he is enjoying very good health and being free in Cuba. Any time that Mr. Novin comes back to Cuba, I will be very pleased to introduce him to lawyer Da Costa.
I'm delighted to hear it, Mr. Ambassador.
In the third place, and I'm going to finish, Mr. Novins talks about communist-led unions. And the elections that have been held in the unions have resulted in a terrible defeat of the communists. The communists have lost almost all the elections in the unions. So where is the communist influence in Cuba? I think, naturally, that Mr. Novins, incurring these mistakes on account that he took his information from not very reliable sources. And I can assure Mr. Novins, and I'm going to finish now, that if I thought that the Cuban government was a communist, be sure I would not be the ambassador in Washington.
Mr. Ambassador, for the sake of the record, I did not say that the Cuban government was communist anywhere in that report.
Can we now call on Congressman Charles Porter of Oregon?
Well, I'd like to just approach the main question, is Cuba going red? And of course, Mr. Novins answered that question by saying yes. He said it is rapidly becoming a communist beachhead, and it's a totalitarian dictatorship now. You did say that, where you can't stick up your head and argue, or you get called a counter-revolutionary, and the penalty for counter-revolution is death. Now, let's examine that. First of all of us here are against dictatorship. All of us are against communism. We're for democracy. We want to see Cuba become a democracy. So we're not disagreed on that. What we're disagreed on is it a totalitarian dictatorship now? Well, I don't think it is. There's a difference between communist infiltration, which we have in this country and in every free country in the world, and communist domination. Now, just let me list 6 reasons why I don't think Cuba is going red. In the first place, Castro and his top leaders, and some of them are here, are not communists. They speak out against communism and communist dictators. Thirdly, Cubans can criticize without reprisals. I referred Mr. Noven's report to the Inter-American Press Association, and John O'Rourke of the Washington Daily News referred it to Jules Dubois, who is the head of their Committee on Freedom of the Press. Jules Dubois made a very detailed report on the Noven's broadcast, found many errors in it, many errors which I can't go in here today.
Why not,
and he came up. I'll be glad we don't have the time.
If you're going to make charges, let's
I have
specify
10 of them here. But he ends up, there is freedom of the press today in Cuba. Now, an election will be announced soon in Cuba, which is an important thing, and I agree with you, Stuart.
When, Congressman?
It will be announced soon.
When?
5. The communists lost overwhelmingly in the recent labor elections. So we do have infiltration, yes. We have infiltration everywhere, and Cuba has many problems. But Cuba is not a dictatorship today. Now, Mr. Novins told me before the broadcast, as I suspected, he doesn't speak Spanish very well. He spent 2 months down there, half of those 2 months on vacation, half in a vacation, mind you, in a country that's rapidly becoming a communist beachhead and where there's a totalitarian dictatorship.
Mr. Smith, I can't allow that to go on.
Go ahead, please.
What is your source of information?
My source for that is Jules Dubois.
Who?
Jules Dubois, who is the Chicago correspondent for the Chicago Tribune.
Did Mr. Dubois follow me for this month that I allegedly was on vacation?
I'm reading from his letter. He spent half his time in what he described as a dictatorship on vacation, according to what he told me when I saw him briefly in Havana last
Obviously,
month.
you don't think I'm going to tell my competition what I'm doing on a story, do you, Congressman? Let's be reasonable.
Well, I would think that you would have asked Mr. Dubois about
Why?
freedom of the press in Cuba.
Are you suggesting that the way to cover a story is to have a reporter talk to other reporters? I go to
I'm suggesting that Jules Dubois is the best authority on freedom of the press in Latin America in the whole country. He's written this book on Fidel Castro. He has had many medals from people. He knows what's going on down there. And how can you tell about the Cuban press when you can't even read Spanish very well?
Gentlemen, we're coming back to this point in a moment, but first I would like to ask Mr. Leo Chern to say something before Mr. Novins has a good slug of time to answer some of these statements. Mr. Chern.
What I would like to say flows directly from one of the most encouraging statements of all made by Dr. Fidel Castro when he addressed the Overseas Press Club in New York during his visit to this country. He said the best friends of democracy are those who never support tyranny. I accept that. I'm sure we all do. And precisely because we accept it, we are, of course, all very sensitive, therefore, to whether or not those who do support tyranny, and communism is tyranny, whether they find themselves in any of the key important spots in a community. There's no question at all that you gentlemen representing the Cuban government are the best representation of a democratic future. There's no question at all, in my judgment, that virtually all of the cabinet members of the government are equally that representation. But I'd like to quote Congressman Porter, in fact. On May 2nd, Congressman Porter, on the floor of the Congress, described as democratic and able public servants Finance Minister Lopez Fresquet, Ambassador Diego, Foreign Minister Agramonte. They are the hope of Cuba today, he said. Then he continued. The opposing faction, however, include Army Chief Raul Castro, Cabana Fortress Comandante Che Guevara, Labor Chief David Salvador, Revolucion Editor Carlos Franchi. Their policies, and these are Congressman Porter's words, their policies, whatever their intention, are aiding the communists in an attempt to take over the revolution. The concern which I have and share with many in America, and certainly the members of the press, is in this effort to take over a government which so richly deserves a democratic, peaceful future determined by its own people.
Can we have Stuart Novins now to answer some of the statements that have been made?
There have been a lot of statements made.
Will I answer them in Spanish?
No, let's talk about that for just about 30 seconds. That is just about as ridiculous, if you'll forgive the phrase, as any kind of quibbling I've heard. For one thing, I think, to follow your suggestion to its logical conclusion, we should withdraw all reporters from the Middle East who don't speak Arabic or Hebrew. We should withdraw every correspondent who ever goes to any country. The fact is, and I will freely admit it, it was much harder to do it my way, but I got it done.
And you read all the papers, I suppose.
Well, now, what do you want to do? List the papers and have me go down the one by
No,
one?
I just think you
Let
left
me
that
take your
May
charges.
I
and
interrupt just a second?
Just 1 moment.
Yes, because Mr. Novin said in his report that you spoke with hundreds of persons in Cuba.
I did indeed,
In
sir.
English or Spanish?
I spoke in English with those who could
With
speak
hundreds
English,
of
and through
people in
interpreters
Cuba?
with those who did not speak English.
With hundreds of people in Cuba. In English.
Absolutely.
Now, can we let Mr. Novins have the floor for a moment to answer
Yes,
some
I
of
have a
these
letter which is written by Congressman Porter to the Columbia Broadcasting System, the News and Public Affairs Department, under the letterhead of the Congress of the United States, although I assume this is a private letter. And in it he accuses me of putting out a highly misleading report. Those were your words, Congressman?
Amen.
You also said half-truths were submitted by Novins, and you also referred to the observations that we made as extreme and non-factual
You want
statements.
some examples?
No, wait just a minute, Congressman. Let's turn to the congressional record. On May 5th, this was said by a congressman on the floor, speaking about our broadcast. It is an honest, conscientious report. And then the congressman goes on to say, Novin's report, on the whole, intelligent, factual, and sincere, is, I hope, going to help in the process of cleaning up the situation.
I think both of them.
Just a moment. Who said that? Who was the congressman? Congressman Porter.
Right,
You said it.
right.
Would you explain, please, how it is that I can be factual one day and false a week later on the basis of the same statements?
Yes, because by that time I had a report from Jules Dubois, some 4 pages,
Well, I don't
single
intend to
space.
debate him. He's not here.
No, but I had his story about the things that you had said there. I had letters from other people about it too, but Jules Dubois, who is an authority in this field and has received many awards in it.
Modesty forbids me to
Congressman,
suggest that there may
it
be
is-
other authorities than Mr. Dubois. I would hesitate to accept anything that any single source gave me, no matter how meritorious it
He
might
is
be.
the
Congressman.
representative of the Inter-American Press Association.
Were they members of
I
the
don't carry
Inter-American...
the responsibility of sustaining, defending what it is that Stuart Novins did, or what, in fact, CBS ever does. I do know, in the spirit in which this program has been arranged, that there is no one at this table who has not been concerned about the possibility that the present penetration of certain areas of Cuban life by members of the Communist Party may not, in fact, jeopardize a democracy we all seek. I do know,
Well, then why don't we
Mr.
talk
Congressman,
about the
I do
situation?
know,
Let's be
Mr.
specific.
Congressman, that you have been concerned.
I am.
That
I
you
know
were
you are.
deeply concerned when former President Jose Figueres of Costa Rica visited with deep friendship a sister democracy in Cuba. And when he made his first speech to the Cuban people, to have the microphone pulled from his hand by David Salvador, an act not only ungracious, but containing a good deal more. I do know your concern, Mr. Congressman. So that it isn't really either useful or reasonable for us to jockey ourselves into a position that this is a problem that doesn't exist or is not of significant magnitude.
Nobody
Mr.
says
Chairman,
it
this
is.
is a problem which is capable of solution, and we We mentioned that in the report. We suggested in the report that the situation could be changed by Dr. Castro if he called a constitutionally guaranteed free election. Now, the record will show that on several occasions, first he said we'll do it in a year. Then he said we'll do it in 18 months to 2 years. Then he said we'll do it in 4 years.
We're agreed on
Then he
that.
said we won't do it until all poverty is wiped out, until everyone has a hospital bed. Certainly we're all in favor of poverty being wiped out, and we're in favor of hospital beds. But where is the election which will not drive the communist gentlemen into prison, as has been suggested, but will bring them out in the open where you can
This
count
is
them?
a specific and serious point. Can some of our Cuban guests answer this?
I don't get your answer. Please repeat it.
The question is, when will the election be held? We have been concerned because initially Dr. Castro indicated that the election would be held within 18 months after the revolution. Then subsequently he said 2 years.
Yes.
When he was in this country, he said within 4 years. There's been an additional statement of Dr. Castro's in which he indicated there could not be an election until illiteracy, poverty, the other terrible social evils of Cuba are eliminated.
Well, as soon as possible we have election. We will have elections.
The last statement made by Dr. Castro here in the States was that the 4 years was a maximum term, but that elections would be held as soon as possible. And we are waiting for a new statement from Dr. Castro saying when the elections will take place.
Dr. Diego, will you not concede, especially on the basis of the evidence of 2 other Caribbean nations, Venezuela and Costa Rica, for example, that an election 4 years after a revolution is not exactly the best base upon which to build a democratic future?
Well,
you would regard that as rather excessive, would you not?
I am sure
Dr.
that we
Diego?
will have elections much before the
Much
4
before.
years. Yes.
Well, the sooner, gentlemen, the better. In fact, if there were an announcement within the next few days that elections will take place within 12 to 18 months, I do believe a great deal will already have been accomplished to
Mr.
show
Mena,
Cuba
that-
its democratic
That
future.
doesn't, the election or the date of the election has nothing to do with the accusation of Mr. Novis. That not means that Cuba is getting red because the government don't set a date for the election.
Well, but the reverse, though, is true. If elections are to be deferred for a period of up to 4 years, and if, as we know, well, now just one moment. I'm taking Dr. Castro's statement.
Yes.
And if, as we do recognize, there are members of the Communist Party in active and significant roles in areas of Cuban life, then it is reasonable to conclude that the 2 of them do not bode well for a democratic future.
They are defeating all the unions
I think-
in the election that they held.
Once
afraid,
again, that's
gentlemen,
why
that
it
has
is we
happened
wish
which I
elections,
feared would
because
happen.
they'd be defeated.
I'm sorry.
That's right.
A half hour has passed very quickly indeed. I'm afraid I have to thank you now for an interesting and animated and I hope a useful discussion. A hard and fast judgment on Cuba's future will have to wait until that future becomes a little more present. In the meantime, I hope our Cuban friends will acknowledge that an old Latin American complaint against us is now out of date. The complaint is that we are indifferent to our neighbors. In fact, we are vitally and intimately interested in them as we hope they are in us. Good evening.
This special program is Cuba Going Red Part 2 came to you from CBS News on the CBS Radio Network.